Okay, good morning, everybody. I think that most people are connected in the meantime. Um, we're happy to see so many faces, and we welcome our very interesting and broad panel on this discussion between climate youth leaders and trade union leaders. Um, the concept of the panel is a dialogue between both of them, and we have organized it in two broad ways. First, we have a set of dialogues with union leaders and climate action leaders from Ireland, Belgium, and Australia. And then we have a broader panel with more general themes with panelists from India, the Philippines, Germany, and the European Union, Europe. So the first panel, I would like to invite Mira Henchy from the Schools Climate Action Network in Ireland and Jerry Murphy, the president of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And the moderator, the host of the day, will be, of course, Sharon Burrow, the Secretary General of the ITUC. Sharon, the floor is yours.
Good morning and welcome to one of what I hope will be a series of dialogues between union leaders and youth climate activists. There's no doubt that this is the issue of our day. If you think about the crisis we had pre-COVID, indeed there was a crisis of inequality and people were feeling despairing. It was leading to anger in many continents. But there was also the climate crisis. And certainly for trade unions, we had to deal with those things in tandem. So you've all heard of our demands for just transition, because we see there is no choice but to transition to a net zero future in industrial terms. And every sector must change. However, COVID-19 has added a whole range of other challenges to that, but also the opportunity to recover and rebuild societies with a much more sustainable frame. So all jobs, in our view, must be climate friendly jobs. So I'm going to say to you, Mira, that we know the climate's in, there's no discussion there. The science is in, the climate's on the agenda. We have to transition. We've got till 2030 to stabilize the planet. And that means making progress for more than half of the emissions we have to cut. And then we have to get to net zero. For us, that's got to be a just transition. But what do you see as the largest obstacle to that future? Where do you see the obstacle to achieving a genuinely sustainable future is? This is no pressure. You're the first cab off the rank. Ireland's got the floor. No?
Thank you very much for that introduction. So hi everyone, my name is Mira. I'm 16 and I'm a climate justice activist based in Cork in Ireland. I think that is the big question really, what is the biggest obstacle that we have to face and how are we actually going to overcome it? And I think that's kind of on the minds of all governments around. But for me as a climate activist, I suppose it's kind of about convincing people that climate change isn't just about, the climate changing sometime far off in the future, and that it's already impacting millions of people worldwide and it's impacting their jobs and their livelihoods, and that it's an urgent issue that's going to impact us all. That being said, it's not going to impact us all equally. Of course, it's going to impact those most vulnerable first and the most severely, even if their communities may not have caused that damage to the environment.
But Mira, if there's one thing that you would ask us all to target as an obstacle to progress, what is it?
I suppose it all comes down to the lack of political will in a way. The governments that are just prioritizing profiting, and that we all kind of have to take a stand against it and prove to politicians that we're not going to just be happy with that. I guess that, striking, for example, is just an amazing way of standing up and Yeah.
Okay, so there's the target. Governments are the obstacle. Jerry, what do you think? Do you think that's the case, or do you think there's other obstacles we have to leap over to get to that net zero future?
Well, I think that government attitude, as reflected by our own here in Ireland, is a key problem which we do need to overcome. While just transition and climate change are features of the public discourse, I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding, both on the part of politicians and I think possibly in wider society, deficits in understanding which we need to tackle and tackle very strongly. I give you an example of that lack of understanding. Recently, here in Ireland, the Minister for Climate Action presented a cycling and walking infrastructure announcement as a key element of a just transition, displaying a remarkable lack of ignorance for a man in such a position. So I think, we have an education problem, we have a communication problem, and we have the old problem of greed amongst big business, all of which factor into this. So it's going to take a concerted effort on the part, not only of the state, but on part of society, and we as representatives of civic society to overcome those three hurdles. I think also that resistance to change, necessary change here in terms of climate, can only be effectively overcome, as I say, by overcoming those three elements that I outlined to you there, but also by bringing about a just transition to an alternative, to the alternative economy, if you like. So we need to create proper jobs, real jobs, which provide decent work and decent pay. And that's further complicated in this jurisdiction in Ireland here by the fact that we have serious issues with collective bargaining, which we also need to comment on that point. We welcome the introduction or the development in Europe of the directive on collective bargaining, which is in the process. So I hope that.
Okay, so well, I think that's really helpful, Jerry, because you've added, yes, we all agree governments are an obstacle, but you've added resistance to change, which I think is indeed an enormous obstacle. And of course, we know the motivation for that can be corporate greed. It can be simply fear from people about their jobs. So I want to leap into the jobs question, and I want to bring in Mark Leemans, because Mark, the issues globally that COVID have exposed dramatically the vulnerability of the workforce. 500 million jobs lost in the formal economy, 1.6 billion of our brothers and sisters in informal work facing destitution. And you know as well as anybody that our way of framing that is to talk about climate and employment proofing our workplaces and our future. So Mark, what's the thing that you would propose to really drive that conversation, bearing in mind those two obstacles that I've picked out from the conversation already, and that is government and resistance to change as an option? How do we climate and employment proof our workplaces?
Good morning, everybody. I think the main entrance for tackling this quite difficult problem is social dialogue, in my opinion. I can see already for a couple of years now that even in Belgium, a country where we have quite some strong social dialogue culture, that we have quite some difficulties to convince people that steps needs to be taken. And most of the time workers say, yeah, we know, there's an awareness, but in my situation, in my position, I'm not able to meet those targets, you advance as a union. And this is all linked to inequality. We see that a lot of people have short-term contracts, very flexible working situations, low income, lousy jobs, no job security, and convincing those people that a transition needs to be made when it comes to climate, when it comes to sustainable economy and so on. That's very difficult for them because they don't feel for themselves that kind of possibility. And they see it more as a disadvantage, an even bigger disadvantage. And the only way to tackle this is by having a strong social dialogue. If you don't have a strong social dialogue and strong unions, a government is very reluctant to take up this problem and do it by itself. So you need a strong counterforce. Unions, civil societies, but especially strong social dialogue, because that is the place where we can discuss with employers and also in a tripartite way with governments. But if you don't have that social dialogue, it will be very difficult, almost impossible to make some progress in
the
this
transition. Yeah. So Bram, you know, Mark is a remarkable leader in our movement, but you're sitting there and you're looking at a future thinking, well, what kind of workplace do I want to join? So what do you want, you know, from, of course, your activism on a collective front is brilliant and we love it. We love when you all march past our offices in the building and we put out our banners and we feel terrific that there are young activists out there taking up this front and center demand for a sustainable future. But when you're looking towards your future, what kind of workplace do you want? And how do you think we can help Mark in that dialogue get there? What do students want for their working future?
Well, what we want for our working future is for sure having security. If we stay to the themes that we have here, is that we have work where it is appreciated. If you want to have a sustainable job and if you want to be, if you want to do good things, and that you don't need to choose between the things of your employee and your things that you want to do yourself to be good for your environment, and that we can be sure that we are going to see, because now for every job, it's what we see in history. I'm a history student as well, is that there first was a battle for having secure workplaces, and that everything needs to be safe. And what we want now is that we also can be sure that everything will be good for the climate and our environment, and that we will see that we will, with everything that we do, is that we see also that it's good for the planet, just as safety, that we see it as the same parameters. I think that would be a good start if we really can create that mentality that we not only need to be things that are good for humans and that are safe, but that we also see climate as the same thing.
Well, it's in fact entwined, isn't it? Because if we don't actually you know, transition to a sustainable base, then the planet won't be very livable for human beings. So that's incredible advice. And I think a lot of young people express the same thing. They want economic justice and decent work, but they also want to make sure that that work is sustainable. But let me take it to a whole other part of the world. And I want to, in fact, go to, do we have Daisy on the line? Did we find Daisy? If not,
we don't have Daisy, but we have Amelia. Amelia. Is
okay, Amelia, I'm going to start with Susan to give you a breather. But in Australia, Susan, we see indeed all of the areas of resistance that you've heard here. You can talk about government opposition, you can talk about fear of change, and Australia doesn't have, in most places, the same social dialogue tradition that indeed Europe has. So, Susan, how do we take what Bram said about making sure our workplaces are indeed both climate friendly and job friendly places for the future? What's the what do you think the biggest challenge for trade unions in Australia is in this regard?
Well, I'm sorry you skipped over my opportunity to say that I think our biggest challenge actually is our federal government, because in reality that is the case actually in Australia, that no change is going to happen unless we have a government that's prepared to take it up. And the problem, I think, is that it's the politics within parties that actually cause the problems. And you know, that also then becomes a problem for workers as well, and for trade unions. You know, I think for you know, many of the issues that have already been raised tonight about you know, if we move from we transition to a much more climate-friendly economy, for example, or jobs and so on, then issues around industrial relations and issues around job security are really critical for trade unions. So I think for us, we've got to be able to convince convince the you know, our members and workers and the public more generally that interlinked is with addressing issues of climate change, addressing issues of climate-friendly jobs, of sustainability, all of those issues. Linked with that has to be the ability for us to have a system which provides secure jobs and real jobs, and that's one of the biggest challenges I think that we actually face. When you look in the industries, for example, that are carbon heavy, you know, many of those jobs are high-paying jobs. And then when you transition those workers to sort of greener, sort of sustainable jobs, many of those jobs are insecure, low-paid jobs. So unless we address that, you know, that sort of, you know, complexity, then we've got little chance of actually being able to convince people that this is something that we need to push governments to do, because in the end, it is actually about governments taking action. Yeah.
So, Amelia, is that how you read it? What do the students in Australia talk about that they think will shift all of the actors, the obstacles? What when you sit down and plan for your next strike or whatever, who is the target? What do you want to see for a future that gives you those climate-friendly jobs, but at the same time gives you an understanding that that's backed by major players, trade unions, governments, employers? How do you see we reach this future?
Definitely. Like, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge country that I'm on. So I acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which I work personally and live on. I'm on Wallumendigal land, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, water, and community. I also pay respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So I feel like...
Let me explain to our colleagues that in Australia, there's a very strong tradition where you wouldn't start a meeting in Australia without acknowledging that there were prior owners, in fact, still own the traditional owners of our lands, which are our Indigenous people. And it's an issue of, you know, justice that has dogged us as a nation for many, many years. So while we're a migrant country, nevertheless, our Indigenous people still on the socioeconomic spectrum are in probably the least equal position, and their lands are often simply taken away, have been traditionally taken away from them. So thank you, Amelia.
That's right. So as school strikers in Australia, we've found that speaking with First Nations communities, we've been able to see why jobs in the climate sector are so important, and we really would love to see by the federal government and by unions and big organisations really pushing for those climate-friendly jobs. And for these people who are in these sectors who are very like carbon heavy, very traditional, dirty industries, so like coal and gas, we want these jobs to be like people to be retrained and actually be able to put into jobs with a similar skill sets for them and also similar passions for them, as it's the government's responsibility to make sure no industry, no region, no person is left behind. And we feel like as students, we have like a role to kind of push for this, as many of us are going to be entering the workforce in the next 5 to 10 years. We really want to be seeing these new climate friendly jobs as well as jobs for like our predecessors, so like people much older than us and our parents being able to still have jobs that are just as high paying, but in a like more sustainable future. And we feel like with the example of like going in Victoria, what was a state in Australia, we've seen the mines being shut down and power stations, and then these people being retrained into jobs in the sector that is similar skill set and they are just as well suited for.
And that's all about having a plan, isn't it? Which I think all of you have basically touched on. If governments don't have plans, if employers aren't at the table as part of the dialogue, if we're not actually transitioning every industry. I can give you some hope that yesterday, in fact, there were, difficult discussions, but in Central and Eastern Europe, which is a very poor regional part of Europe, then there was indeed a discussion in partnership between employers and workers on how to transition the steel industry, for example, to clean steel. It's possible. The cement industry, it's possible. We often focus on the energy industry, but in fact, that is in transition. It's hard and it's painful, but it is in transition, not fast enough perhaps, but it's there. What we're not looking at enough is how you transition every industry. So there is hope out there of that dialogue table Mark talks about. It's just hard work and persistent. But I want to come back to indeed Ireland and ask Jerry, there's a climate bill in the Parliament. You touched on it, and it's inadequate, I know, because I was part of a dialogue there last month, I think, sometime in the last few weeks. What is it, Jerry, that you would change? What's the one thing you would change about that climate bill that would give us hope of getting the dialogue, the climate-friendly jobs that need investment, and indeed the just transition we all want?
Well, thanks, Sharon. The bill seems to be 50% of what it needs to be, roughly, insofar as, while it does commit the government to up to 2030 to reducing emissions by 7% per annum in every year up to that. What it doesn't do, and it's a glaring omission, what it doesn't do is address the issue of just transition. The concept even of just transition, never mind practical steps. And we as a trade union movement here on this island are campaigning vigorously to have that gap, if you like, fixed, and to have just transition stitched right into the bill. While it's essential that we take action, to reduce emissions, we're not, for all the reasons which have previously been outlined by the speakers who spoke already here this morning, unless we address those fundamental issues around, decent pay, decent work, along with convincing, the skeptics, both in government and industry and across the wider population, that this is essential and necessary and urgent, we're gonna fail. And it just seems that our government, with this climate action bill, had imagined, or appear to have imagined, that they can do half a job. Half a job isn't going to save this. Half a job isn't going to, provide Bram or Mira or anyone else with the secure future for themselves and indeed their children and their children's children. So, we have to, it's an imperative that just transition comes into the legislation, the Climate Action Bill. And on top of that, it in itself, it remains not enough. This has to be part of a broader, wider strategy, as I said earlier, involving education, cooperation, and, if you like, the building of momentum around the notion that this planet needs to be saved and saved now.
And momentum's really important, isn't it? That you've all learned, of course, from both the climate mobilisation from students, but also traditional union organising and mobilisation. I want to come back to the students with a question on that. But Mark, let me jump to you and say there's a bill in the European Parliament, the recovery plans of Europe are based on 3 pillars. One's the social pillar of rights. The second is the green, the climate bill, the Green Deal. And the third one is, of course, just transition. What do we have to do to make sure that just transition that brings with it both rights and the Green Deal aspirations of what's missing in the just transition frame? I know you said social dialogue earlier, but what can the European Parliament do to affect genuinely just transition so every sector can make the journey?
Yes, thank you. I think the European Parliament can do quite a lot, and even an amount of work that we would not be able to do at the level of a member state. Because even in Europe, we see other countries always as a kind of competitor and another markets. And so what Europe can do is create a level playing field and organize more social control amongst member states in order not to allow that climate and sustainable or unsustainable economy can become an element of competition. And even if you want to call it in such a way of dumping, economical dumping. So I think Europe is really taking the lead in a discussion that even the most progressive countries by themselves in Europe would not be able to do. So, and I'm a strong supporter of a strong Europe, because I see that at a lot of levels, they can encourage member states and even put some pressure on member states to be more active on the level of sustainable and climate-oriented economy. It's not only about that transition, because what we lack also in Europe before, for instance, is we don't have any tax coherence at all. Also, taxation is an element of difference and also of competition between member states. And for instance, in Belgium, a country which is highly taxed, or in which we have a high taxation, environmental issues or sustainable elements are very rarely subject of taxation. And for instance, we are very much in favor to say, let the polluter pay. If you pollute, then you should at least contribute to be able or to make the government in a position that they can adjust your behavior. Those elements are very important, I think, and Europe can really take the lead.
And it's an advantage as much as it's highly tension-ridden and contestable. It's an advantage Europe has to actually act across the things Mark's talking about. Tax, not austerity, is one of our major campaign areas, because there are very serious areas of taxation injustice, and Mark's touched on one of them. The other is, of course, that, you know, if you're a tiny country, it's very hard to do this on your own. But the collective power of transition across industry in a European context does have real merit, and it brings up that issue of dumping Mark talked about, because there will be border adjustment mechanisms that will actually mean every other nation that wants to trade in and out of Europe as they make this transition is going to have to meet those standards. So there's some hope. Susan, I'm going to come back to you to wrap this section up, but in the meantime, let me go to our student activists who are we are so pleased to have you with us today. And I'm going to ask you, Amelia, you know, the government has to our government in Australia, like every other government, has to put up their nationally defined contributions to the next climate conference, which has been deferred, of course, but is in Glasgow at the end of next year. I think it's COP26, if I've got the numbers right, Bert. And so you know, we've got a big fight on our hands everywhere to join forces to get governments to raise their ambition, to put indeed the ambition for emissions reduction as high as possible. And then, of course, we want them to commit to just transition and dialogue in the context of those NDCs. So, Amir, could the trade unions and the students in Australia join forces to really push the Australian government to increase its ambition with its nationally defined contribution?
Definitely. I feel like in the past we've seen with our actions, we've seen unions and school strikers collaborate together to push for climate to be in the forefront of like the political agenda. And with the recent like kind of COP26 being delayed, we're seeing that like many young people, many unions are trying to push for climate action and putting climate change justice first and not being a political issue as it shouldn't be partisan. It's a matter for human race, as I've constantly said, and I've heard in the climate movement, all people's lives depend on it. And we should not make it just a game going, oh, whoever deals with it can deal with it. So many people are already affected on the forefront of it. As we'll hear later, people from the Pacific and Asian regions seeing their homes being destroyed by natural disasters. We really need to have, as unions and students combine, using like the power of non-traditional mobilization methods, so like social media, the media in general, collaborating by like posting stuff, sending letters to our like, politicians, and this is something you can do throughout the world, and really collaborating to go, this is what we want to happen, as these people in Parliament are meant to be representing us, but not so much are representing us now with this issue of climate change, as it shouldn't be pushed aside, as everything we think about is dependent on it.
Well, there you go. I think we need a youth council in Australia, Susan, and Amelia could certainly, lead it, because there's no doubt that collaboration is critical. But let me come back to Susan after I hear Bram. What do you think we can do? There's a question in the chat from one of your colleagues that actually says to Mark, yes, but how do you get European consensus? So Europe on the surface is indeed committed to 55%, I think it's 55%, Bert will tell me if I get the numbers wrong, reduction, which is in itself more ambitious than other countries will be. But how do you think, how do we get a consensus across the union movements in Europe and indeed the student movement to push all governments to raise their ambition?
Well, it's indeed a big question. It's also the question that we ask ourselves all the time. How can we get the European Union moving towards those goals? Because as we all know, the European Union is always very ambitious in their communication, but then it always comes down to the member states. And then we notice that things are failing a bit. And we also see this in Belgium, where we even have those different regions with totally different goals. So what we always try to do is to show that this is important for everyone, that it's good for everyone if we reach those goals and if we go for it, and that the fight for a climate transition is also for a good climate transition, that's also the same fight for being able to provide jobs in the future, because it will be really hard to sustain our economy if we have a bad climate. Because now with COVID, we all are talking about our economy, but we're not realizing that maybe the climate change and the consequences that it will have for future in Europe, or even now, will even be a bigger threat for our economy. And that's really the message that we try to bring. And we also try to not only focus on our member states, but we really try to bring together the European story and to show that we need to help each other in achieving those goals. Because, for example, in March, before all this Corona situation happened, we were together in Brussels with youth activists from all around Europe, from the 27 member states then, and the UK and Switzerland, together striking for asking for that more ambition. And I think if we have the unions together in those fights, it will make us only stronger.
Thanks, Bram. And indeed, Bert's putting a free ad in the chat, but there is a question for, Bert is with our team religiously scoring on a simple basis the NDCs as they come in. And we would love you in your country to take them and amplify them, to actually say to the government, it's not good enough and you need to do better. But Mira, do you see in the next year, are we going to see trade unionists and youth on the streets together around ambition as we get towards COP26? What would you like to see? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I am really hopeful that our movements can definitely join forces even more in the future. I mean, in Ireland, we already have joined forces. For example, some trade unions open their doors for our members to have meeting spaces in their branches, and also we've been provided with so much support in getting advice and helping with publicity of our strikes. So I think that sort of support has just hugely been so valuable for our movement here in Ireland, and I would love to see that support continue, but also for there to be more collaboration and dialogue between our movements, because ultimately our causes do align and our goals ultimately align. So I think just continuing the pressure is going to need the joining of several movements. So I hope that can continue the collaboration.
So Susan, I'm going to ask you a totally left field question, because I think everybody accepts that while the Morrison government is there and captive of, you know, the traditional fossil fuel lobby, that they're not going to shift very much. And that's really tragic in a really vulnerable country like Australia. Fire, floods, you know, all sorts of risks that, you know, seem extreme from everywhere else in the world, except perhaps California and a few other areas that are burning. But, you know, if we have to build a countervailing power in Australia, there are really good city mayors and there are good leaders at the state level. How do you think with the students we might find ways of elevating their voice in the community, which is, you know, going to balance out some of that terrible leadership from the national government? It's almost like a European question, just in a different political structure.
Yes, I think it's a really good point, Sharon. I was reflecting when Bram, I think, was talking about the ambitious nature of the European Union, but then the member states being not so ambitious. In some ways in Australia, we've got completely the opposite. We've got not member states, but we've got the states of Australia all committed to addressing issues of climate change and setting targets, with a federal government that actually will not do it. They simply, and I agree with you, I think it's going to be very difficult. Maybe the bill that's in the Parliament now, that's been put by an independent, Zali Steggall, will get through, actually, and that would be good. But really, I think, you know, a lot of the change and pressure in Australia is going to have to happen from what we do at the state level. And I hadn't thought about that, but you're quite right, at the large city level, at the mayoral level and city level. And I think that, you know, the student movement and the trade union movement have worked relatively well together. We've sort of come together. I hope you would agree with me, Amelia, but not in total, actually. It's not right across the board. You know, my union, the Australian Education Union, absolutely, we've provided support. You know, in very many ways, we recognise the rights of students to stand up, you know, the democratic rights to take strike action, all of those things, and we do everything that we can. But I think that there is much more work to be done in Australia, joining the whole of the union movement, the trade union movement, with the student movement and with other, as I think Amelia said, and others, other social movements in Australia. And that our pressure, if we can actually assist the state governments to actually achieve their goals, then we will actually put much more pressure on the federal government, because they will have no choice, actually, because it's going to be happening around them. And I think for us, it's a matter of looking at it all in a different way. You know, that, you know, I feel despair a lot of the time with the Morrison government, because, you know, not every country, as you say, experiences what we've experienced in Australia this year with the fires, for example. And the fires starting again. We're going into our summer and they are starting again. And we're one of the biggest polluters in the world. And yet we, as a nation, cannot come to some plan, some conclusions that we need to come to. So I think we really have to have another think about this and think, is there another way we can do it? And one of the ways that we can do that is to actually put the pressure from underneath, if you like, to federal government. And the advantage about that is that it pushes all political parties, because it pushes the Labor Party as well, which is really critical in all of this, because they're not there yet either, actually. And so we can, if we do that, I think it does need some additional thinking, but it does need the trade union movement. And it's all right for me because I'm not the president or secretary of the ACTU, you know, so I can't speak, but for the whole of the movement, or you know, but I do think that we need to actually collectively rethink about the ways we can actually join on the issues. And there are ways in which we can do it, because you know, as I said before, one of the biggest problems that we've got, I think, is actually convincing workers that actually there are ways in addressing their issues. Lots of people have talked about that. And I think that, you know, we've got to address those issues, but collectively coming together as movements, as social movements, is critical to that, I think. Mm.
So, Susan, if looking back now and knowing where the world is in terms of both, you know, a crisis of inequality and climate and the vulnerability that everybody's talked about, what advice would you give your 15-year-old self now in one sentence?
Wow. I think the advice I would give myself is that the capitalist consumer world that I grew up in and sort of aspired to in some ways was the wrong direction.
There you go.
That's what I'd say.
Mark, what would you tell your 15-year-old self? You're on mute. He doesn't want us to hear this answer.
Okay, my 50-year-old son, then Sharon, I think you think I'm younger than I look.
No, your 15-year-old self, when you were
okay.
15.
My 15-year-old self.
Yeah.
This is a very difficult question because, of course, I'm a trade union leader and we are very ambitious, but at the same time, very pragmatic and realistic. And we want to advance as much as possible, but then also not to lose the people that we represent. So it's really a very important challenge to take the lead, to develop good proposals, to inform your own people, to create awareness, but also to create a feeling that together we can do something about it. And so I adore the energy and the commitment of young people of 15 or a little bit older, but at the same time you need to make a link with the experience and the collective force that a union can provide. And so that is really the main challenge. And in Belgium, I think we managed to do it, but not in a perfect way. We have already since 2008 a climate coalition in which the unions work together with the civil societies around climate and sustainable economy and so on. And last year, 2 years ago, we saw the Youth for Climate coming up. And as a union, we support very much. But as Susan said also, we don't want to take over that movement, because then it can be looked as it's again something from those old unions and so on. So I would like to be a 15-year union leader, but I am unfortunately almost 60. So
we're going to have this conversation over a drink, Mark. I'm really interested now to know what indeed you were like at 15 and what your aspirations were. But Jerry, looking back, you're 15, but you've had all the life experience. What's the one thing in this situation we're in you would say to yourself as a 15-year-old?
I think at the risk of sounding flippant that I need to get out of this bed a bit earlier in the mornings.
We can say that to ourselves now, Jerry.
No, but in all seriousness, I'm incredibly proud of we're using 15 here in a generic sense, but I'm very proud of our teenagers here in Ireland. That they have managed to do something which I and my generation didn't do, if you like, in that they have mobilized, they have forced themselves into the national discourse. And, we as trade unions are, I think, honour bound and duty bound indeed to continue to support and assist them on this very righteous, to use a very 21st century word, on this righteous path. For me, as a 15-year-old, I wish I was 15 again for a whole lot of reasons, but because this is a fight, which, unlike perhaps some of the ones that I chose to involve myself in at the time, but this is one which makes a difference to the entire world.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, this world, this 21st century, we here in this third decade, or in this third decade of the 21st century, have available to us a whole range of tools and opportunities which weren't available to me as a 15-year-old, and which lend themselves to campaigning. And I have to say, our young people are to be commended for seizing upon those tools and exploiting them to the full. And I, as president of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, will continue
Well,
to provide every support it can to them.
There you go. You have reinforcement. You have the acknowledgement from Susan that we've probably constructed a path of our own making as a generation or three that we need to now readjust. And of course, you've got Mark's call to join the union movement and to actually think about what kind of future you want. But really, it's the young people who should, in this section, have the last say. And I want to ask you what advice, one thing, one sentence you have for us. If there's one thing you want trade union leaders to do, what is it? Bram, I'm going to start with you. What is it that you want the trade union leaders of the world to do?
Well, a lot of things, but the thing that I think is the most important is to show the workers who are afraid of losing their jobs due to a just climate transition, to really show them that a just climate transition is in line with their jobs, and to really show that they shouldn't be afraid of it, and that we all should go together for a better climate, and that it is one fight and not against each other, but together. So really short, that's what I want to advise.
Well, that for us is what Just Transition is about. So Mark, here you have a future union leader with climate in his DNA. And indeed, let's go to you, Mira. What's the one thing you want? And I noticed David Joyce is on the call as well from the Irish Council of Trade Union. So what's the one thing what piece of advice, what request, one sentence you would give to union leaders around the world and in Ireland, of course?
I would say join us because we are fighting for the same thing. We need to continue uniting our causes because they align, and we really need to work together. So yeah, join our fight.
And Amelia, we have an intergenerational commitment to conversation, but I must say I need to thank you and the students of Australia, because you were the ones that wrote to me and said, how can we get into this conversation? So you've probably started now a series of these, and so can you take that back to your whole group? But what is it that you want us to do? What's your one request of trade unionists everywhere?
I feel like as many strikers were under 18, as in Australia, our voting age is 18, so we're unable to be represented in these political discussions. So I feel like one thing what many climate activists in Australia really would love is trade unions to represent us in these big political debates. They're going, pushing our demands to our politicians, going, this is what the young people want. This is what should happen. And as Davis was saying, we should work together in collaboration and not be divided, as we all have such great power by being able to mobilize our groups and work together for the common goal.
Brilliant. Well, I can tell you that, you know, I'm really delighted to have been able to have this conversation with you. We're going to take it to the next level, so please don't go away with a international panel. I know Susan's got an executive, so she might need to go and prepare for that. Even though she's in Australia, it's a global executive. And so I totally understand if people have other things to do, but if you can stay on, we want to take it now to the same mix of leaders internationally and activists, because if the climate conference in Glasgow is going to be the success we want it to be, then we need a global push. But can I say to all of you, thank you. And just to give you a sense that we actually see that it's your generation, but it's also generations to come. There's been a huge push recently, and I know Susan and others will have supported it, but we all need to support the demand for climate education, for the science of climate, and indeed environmental or planetary boundaries to be part and parcel of school curriculum. So you'll see people pushing that out. As a former teacher myself, I can't think of anything more important in this world than to make the connections between a sustainable planet and a sustainable future for working people. So thank you all very much, and I hope you hold these conversations in your own country and then bring back advice to us. But stay with us, because you might be able to field some questions in the next session. Thank you all, and for particularly those who were, for whom it's quite late at night in Australia. I want to now go to a mix of regional and international activists. I have worked with Louisa recently, so let me introduce Louisa from Germany. And indeed, I just, Louisa, you might not know this, but I came back and said the minute she graduates, I actually want to recruit this woman. So there you go. The pressure's on. And Mitzi is indeed with us from the Philippines. And Mitzi has a regional activist perspective, like Louisa, who's working across Europe. But then we also have indeed Hita, who's from India. And that's a very difficult environment, but again, very courageous work across a very big country and surrounding countries. And Ludovic, indeed, oh, I should have said, sorry, Hita is also the rep on the UN Youth Council. So she's your voice into the UN, and this is your chance to ask her questions about, or to give her advice about what you want. And Ludovic, of course, is our, well, he's not so young, but he is indeed reasonably young. And he's the person in the European Trade Union Council with the hotspot at the moment because of all the things we talked about in terms of recovery, the Green Deal, just transition. So if you could make sure you've all got your cameras open, I think you have, then Nita, I'm going to start, Hita, sorry, I'm going to start with you because you see it from the challenges of India, but indeed the voice of global youth. And again, I'm going to ask you the same question. If the science is in, what do you see as the single obstacle to global collaboration around transitioning to a sustainable future?
Thank you, Sharon. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I don't want to actually repeat what the previous speaker said. I think they've articulated it really well, but I think it still is lack of political will, and not just political will, but also lack for this inertia to move towards a different economy, to move towards a way of life that is not so-called the conventional way of life we've been seeing from years. It's not the sort of development that we have envisioned for ourselves. It's whether it's large corporations, whether it's government, whether it's even individuals sometimes. I take workshops in climate education, and I was talking to a class of 6th graders, 11-year-olds in India. recently, about a couple of weeks ago, and they were so skeptical about. I asked them, if you had the chance to dream of a world, what kind of a world would you dream for yourself? And they were so skeptical about a green world. They said, we can dream, but we know it's never going to happen. And I think this is something that needs to change. If there are 11-year-old kids thinking that you're never going to have a green, clean world, how do you expect governments to make this decision? How do you expect governments to believe that we can move towards the world? So I think what we need is it has to be individual, where we have to realize that if we really truly want to achieve this, we have to be able to dream it and believe that we can get towards a greener world, a more just, sustainable world.
Well, that's sobering, isn't it? If an 11-year-old thinks that our world is doomed, then we all have work to do, indeed, through all the generations. Louisa, we talked about economic and social justice and how you brought those things together recently. And you've done a lot of deep thinking about this, not just in Germany, but across Europe. So what do you think is what's the solution to those obstacles? We've heard political will, we've heard resistance to change, a lack of trust in a better future. But what do you think is really at the heart of how we drive collective action?
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me today. Thank you for this amazing moderation. And I do actually believe we will meet again on Saturday. I just saw on another panel.
Excellent. We should tell people what we're doing collectively on Saturday. I've been privileged to be asked to address one of the political parties in Germany on Saturday about their climate policy. So, Louisa, I'm glad you're joining me, because otherwise that's a bit of a daunting task as an outsider, but great.
I think it's incredible. It's actually one of the governing parties. So it's it's the Social Democrat Party, and they're really behind climate targets. So I think that would be fun. But coming back to your question, I really want to second, first of all, what Hito just pointed out. There is, in this larger crisis we are seeing, there's also a crisis of imagination. So how can we work towards a better world that we cannot even imagine yet? And that is a huge issue, because, at that point that we lack the pictures of this different, more just, dignified futures for everyone, for workers, for youth, for people around. At that moment that we lack that, obviously, it's, we just quadruple the energy it needs to get there. Yet at that point that we have a vision of what we could, what kind of society we could live in, we make it so much easier, and maybe even just, make it then possible. Yet I think there's one, why is it that we are here discussing the discrepancy that is there between workers' jobs and right for guaranteed work on the one side, and nature protecting climate? Why is there a gap in the first place? And I think there we get to one of those root issues, is that it's actually political myth. It's how workers and environmental forces have been used against each other to play each other out, saying there is no way we can protect the climate if we want to protect jobs, claiming that there is some or between this. We have to make a decision whether our work, contributes towards a safe and just world or not. Yet that isn't the case. So eventually, I think overcoming this apparent discrepancy, that is only a discrepancy at that point that we let it be, we are empowering a whole other story that is so much stronger. This is the story of people who work towards a safe and just world, with dignified world that works towards a future and not against it. But looking at political environments around the world is just so far a very, very successful strategy to play out workers against climate activists or nature conservation interests. And I think, overcoming or taking apart, uncovering the strategy as a strategy, just to lower our forces, that is really the key thing, I believe.
So I think the power of that, Louisa, is where you said dare to dream, but it's about how we take that and build a narrative that can actually garnish people's trust. Because when people can see themselves in a future, then there's a lot more trust. And you heard it in the panel before, that fear, the fear of change, resistance to change is one of our biggest obstacles. So there's a real challenge here. And I'm going to ask indeed, Mitzi, do you think we can actually build that narrative together? Can we actually build a sense of trust and demand in a very different future?
I would say we have to. A lot of people will say that it's not realistic or you're dreaming too much. But really, why are we compromising on our future? Why are we compromising on our survival? This isn't something that we should be compromising because these are our basic human rights. We have the right to have a just world. We have the right to live in a safe environment and to have workers' rights and for people to have jobs. And just building on what Louisa already said, and what you've said earlier with the fear to resistance and the gap, we have to look at who is instilling that fear in us, who is instilling that gap in between the two sectors. It is the people in power right now who are the elite few. So the question now is, do we have the right type of leaders? Do we have a system that truly allows the leadership of the majority, or is it a system that will only serve the elite few?
Well, that's a big challenge. And I saw you nodding profusely when Louisa said that all too often, you know, unions and students or climate activists had been set against each other quite deliberately. So there's a huge set of challenges there. Let me just bring in Ludwig first. I see a hand here and I'll come back to you, but let me bring, oh, maybe it was a clap actually. I think you got a clap, Mitzi. But let me go to you, Ludovic. I know that I said you're in the hot seat. It's true. You're now really in the hot seat because you've heard what the young activists say. So do you think it's possible? Can we affect this change in Europe? And how do we actually rely on the power of all voices collectively to build our demands?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. I think it's really an important discussion and dialogue that we are doing here. As I think we are, as it was presented by also the other discussant, I think we are the defender of rights. We are defenders of human, climate, social rights. We are on the same fight. We, of course, occupy also different battlegrounds, I would say. So we have to use the different tools that that we have. So collective action. We have also, as a trade unionist, the social dialogue, and then trying to ensure that we manage the change through discussion with employers. So we have, I would say, a different responsibility, but the same fight. And I think that we have to work for this story. There's a storytelling to build that unite the climate and social aspect, with a future made of decent jobs, with a future made of less pollution and less people dying from air pollution, with more biodiversity. So I think that for this, we are clearly on the same narrative. Then when it comes to what happens concretely, we need political action, we need climate action, clearly that links climate action with just transition, because the problem is that we cannot disconnect the climate targets, for example, from the just transition. You know that at European level, we are they are discussing at council level this week the discussion on the how they will increase the target to 55%. We think it's really positive to go to 55% for 2030. But if you disconnect this discussion from just transition, then you disconnect the discussion on climate targets from people. So this is something that we can't let go like this, and we need really to tackle the different dimensions that also workers have, as it was previously mentioned, the fear. I would just, for example, take one or two examples. With the recovery in Europe and the investment that will be done with the recovery for climate action, there will be a lot of opportunities of creation of jobs in green jobs. This is clear. But what will be the working conditions in these sectors? When we look at the renovation wave, that is really promising and that can really create decent jobs at local level. We know that as trade unionists that in the construction sector, the working conditions are quite low. So this is something that we have to tackle. When we discuss about the phase out of coal, of course, we agree about the phase out of coal. But when we discuss about the creation of the potential creation of jobs in offshore wind, that is really positive. It will not happen at the same place where the coal mine will close. So the question here of this discrepancy on the regions affected and the job creation is really a problem, because we have to build a future for the regions that are affected also. We cannot just leave them to the obligation to migrate to find another job internally in Europe. So yeah, I would stay brief and continue the discussion after, I think.
Thank you, Ludovic. And indeed, it's not easy to get all of that into the questions of representation at the European level. So I know Ludovic means it when he says that indeed the movements have to be joined together in that regard. But I will tell you that we were part of we've been holding these series of discussions with trade unionists and with industrial leaders. But the discussion on wind energy and wind energy policy with the European Union was actually really positive. When you saw trade unions across Europe looking at how to build decent jobs, as opposed to being frightened about having to make sure no one's left behind, the conversation, as Ludovic said, switched dramatically. Wind energy is huge in Europe. Indeed, I think Denmark now totally depends on wind energy and is exporting wind energy. So it's possible, whether it's solar, wind, tidal, whatever the renewable frame is, it's the transition that's difficult. So let me go back to indeed Hita and say, you know, what more can we expect of the UN? Because a little bit like you heard Mark talk about the power of leveraging up the authority of the European Union, which is what Ludovic and the ETUC are indeed doing. What can we do to help you leverage up the authority of the UN? And while Hita's thinking about her answer, can I ask any of you just to put your hand up if you want to ask, if you've got a burning question? I know there's a lot of activism and expertise out there, so just go to the participants piece, find the hand, put it up, and we'll try to take a few questions. So Hita, over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. I think this is very valid, and sometimes a lot of us, especially after climate conferences, especially like last year in Madrid, when we did not get the desired result that we'd wanted out of the conference, people keep pointing fingers and saying the UN isn't doing enough, or it's too slow. And that is right to a certain extent, but there's also two sides to it, because the UNFCCC in particular can't do much other than facilitate the dialogue. It is the countries, the member states that are part of it, that actually make the difference there. And I think this is where we have to understand that it's a two-way street. So we have to push our countries to do more internationally, make ambitious commitments, like, for example, when we're talking about the NDCs this year that need to be redrafted, or basically renew their NDCs, have higher ambitions to come in line with the Paris Agreement. But at the same time, I think we also need to push UN authorities, different UN bodies, depending on what their work is and where their structures are, on how can they also complement what countries are doing? How can they give them support to, have higher ambition, maybe help in capacity building, maybe help in training, maybe help in ensuring when this transition is happening between industries, it is indeed just, and it's not what Ludovic said, where people are losing jobs and having to migrate to different places just because we're moving towards a more sustainable future. So I think both of these go hand in hand, but I think it's our role as civil society, as all of us who are not necessarily part of government decision-making processes, to push governments, also to push UN to do more and say, this is something that we need to see for ourselves, for future generations. And we have to push and hold them accountable year after year, month after month, to see that you're not doing enough. Or if they are, also just commend them and say, we're not just here to point fingers, we're also here to support you. We're here to build capacity for you, to bring on these additional hands on deck. So we're not just here to keep blaming the governments, but also help work with them and reach to the point where we want to reach collectively.
And I think if you look at Antonio Guterres's most recent speech, but a whole range of them, he's totally committed indeed to 1.5, totally. And so it's not for a lack of voice, but a lack of authority or collective authority, as Hita says. But we can only keep raising our voice because it will take the whole world. But Mitzi, you live in a part of the world where the intergovernmental organization is actually ASEAN, and it's the group of Asian countries. There is ASEAN Plus, so you include, of course, Australia and China and others, but the ASEAN group of governments are, absolutely committed to the industrial development of Asia, but not necessarily the development of people in terms of distribution or the climate. So what do we have to do to back in your voices to the ASEAN group of governments, because they hold an awful lot of the emissions bucket in our world?
That's actually what's so crazy. Asia is one of the most affected regions by the climate crisis, yet we are also one of the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. So there is a disconnect there where some of the countries in ASEAN aren't as impacted and are contributing so much to the destruction happening in their neighbors' countries. And we see the lack of solidarity in these countries. And that's why it's so important for the Asian youth to really come together and have a united voice to demand for change, to demand for justice. And we did recently have a regional-wide day of action. It was called Asian Climate Rally, which you can look at asianclimaterally.net. And it was amazing because for the first time in a very long time, youth activists from all around Asia came together and demanded for a common set of demands. And what we need to do forward now is to really support these regional actions, to highlight what's happening in Asia, and to have Asia climate strikers have a spot in the global conversations as well, to see that we are not just, it's not just these countries that are acting separately, but we're acting together as a region.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, and certainly we should take that back to our Asia Pacific region. And maybe, Mitzi, you can help me create an intergenerational dialogue with the regional secretary there, Shoya, who's a Japanese man. He's terrific. So let's see what we can do early in the new year. And then, coming back indeed to Louisa. Louisa, Europe has a connection, but you heard Mark Lehman's earlier talk about indeed how, we need to get more pressure collectively to see through the issues that Ludovic's dealing with in terms of the Green Deal, just transition, etc. So what's your advice to all of us if we all see Europe as indeed setting the floor for ambition? What's your advice to all of us? What are the 3 things we need to do in the next 6 to 12 months, not just facing the COP, but facing Europe to effect a sustainable recovery?
It's a very, very good question. So I think one claim that is often being made about anything happen in terms of climate protection in Europe is the claim that it has to be, protecting all kind of wealth in order for other regions in the world to be able to kind of follow along or copy that model. But what it effectively means is using, the aspect of protection of wealth, whatever that may be in that context, to slow down climate ambition. Yet there's no point in kind of, understanding oneself as leader in something while failing to live up to the targets oneself has set. So there obviously needs to be a tangible way in which we move forward while acknowledging, what needs to be done for 1.5, and then kind of twisting that and creating that and designing this in a way that protects actual people and their livelihoods, meaning also their work environments and jobs that can actually sustain them for long term. I think one thing there is, coming back, I really like the aspect of, looking at 6 months, looking at 12 months. I think that is really something we need to focus on. It's about this 1 year, that's about 2021, that we should, level up whatever is done. One thing, of course, is highlighting what is there in really forward-looking, ambitious collaboration that's already happening. And I mentioned in another talk that we had, Sharon, that there is, for instance, this amazing connection between workers of public transport and climate movements in many places in Germany, but also, in other regions across the continent, where, interests is really matched, because everyone knows we need better public transport, but for that we need a better and safer and more sustainable working environment. And suddenly there are there are metro strikes from workers and climate activists together. And it's just, it's beautiful in so many ways. And these are those stories that we need to really emphasize, that we need to bring forward for others to be able to copy that. No one has to, rebuild and redesign and recreate everything that needs to be done. Loads of amazing ideas and projects and actions are already happening, and they're out there. And I think one thing also in a sense of sustainable work, activism, and transitioning is to find out what is already happening and how do we, put it on a stage it deserves. Second thing is really focusing on not, on coming out together in shared in a shared manner. It often seems to me that there's a climate activist side who says, well, we obviously want to protect jobs, and then there's a union work environment that says, yeah, we do care about the environment, the climate too, but the actual unification, that is not happening in the way it could. And that means also, beyond shared documents and shared writings, it's about, shared speeches given, shared meetings. When is it that union leaders from Europe and climate activists approach Ursula von der Leyen together, or the heads of state together? When do they, actually have those shared meetings where they say, look, you know what, we're going to sit down on a table and we're going to discuss those things, but you're not going to get us apart, because on the fundamentals, on the basics, we agree, and it's your job to provide political answers. And the third thing really is that I feel we need to acknowledge that this is a very, very tense time, and the average individual is probably feeling worse right now than they usually are, because we're just in multiple crises. Lots of jobs are insecure. The climate is in a devastating state, and we're still in a pandemic. And I feel acknowledging that it's a really stressful time, and approaching our struggles, our fight, with a sentiment of, humanizing what we're doing, acknowledging we are, all just people who feel and who have everyday struggles, which is obviously tough, but it's always also the very first stage we can connect on. So let us be personal in this, let us be human in this, let us connect on an individual base from person to person, and find out that there's so many things, we have in common, and that by the end of the day, we all care about a just and safe and dignified future for everyone, and also that work that contributes to that in the long term.
Excellent. So, Ludovic, I'm coming to you because indeed you've got a whole plan of action over the next 6 to 12 months. So if we can pick out 3 things that you think are most important for the union movement and indeed looking to the European Union, that would be terrific. But let me first of all invite everybody to think about how we also act in place, because the cities, there's a group of mayors around the world called the C40 group of mayors, and they are largely progressive mayors who've committed to livable cities. And Louisa raised the question of mass transit, of people acting together in their own interests, but also in the interests of, electrification and climate-friendly transit, carless cities. I mean, there's a whole range of challenges for trade unionists, but there's a whole range of opportunities for both jobs in manufacturing and sustainability at the same time. And indeed, we have a view as the ITUC that cities are part of a huge part of the solution. think they're about 45% of emissions globally. If you could get people, maybe even more than that, Bert, if you could actually get people to focus on the transition in industries, then even the demand and supply motivation in and out of the cities from the hinterlands or from global trade would need to shift. So it's, you know, maybe we can devote a future conversation to how do we shift our cities. But Louisa, very good point about how we pick out the bits that I would characterize as what have we got in common and how do we actually act together to make that a possibility. But Ludwig, you've got a very difficult job at the moment because it's right in the center of the heat around recovery, but we also know it's about you know, getting the Green Deal and just transition in a spot where we can really drive change. So what are the three things that we can help you with collectively, the students, the ITUC, others? How do we back you in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, really important question. I think in the coming year, we will need to ensure that the Green Deal, the just transition discussion really comes to a reality on the ground. So in society, in the economy. So it's important that we know where we are going, not only setting targets, not only seeing different policies, but that it really implement change in the different sectors of the economy. And for that, I think that two elements. We need decarbonation strategies in all the economy. So it's clear that we have to phase out coal, lignite, peat, oil share, etc. But it's not enough. We also need a massive investment because we will still need cement, we will need steel industry, glass industry, etc. And we want quality jobs in this sector. So there will be a need to invest so that they can use clean technologies. And then also there's a need for complete decarbonation of all the other sectors of the economy. Agriculture, construction, transport, etc. So it's a massive challenge, but we have to know and we have to discuss this with the employers, with policymakers, where it will lead to in terms of jobs, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate, but also in terms of working conditions. So mixing all this discussion and having a concrete pathway and strategy on where we are going. Second aspect, just transition again. We know that climate change will deepen inequalities. Inequalities are already high, but it will also deepen inequalities inside Europe, but also outside of Europe. So this is something also we have to tackle through just transition. And for this, there will be need for financial means to invest in the transformation of the economy that are much bigger than what is on the table at European level. So there's a good first step with the Just Transition Fund at European level. We have pushed for it and we obtained it, but it's really not enough in how it's financed. So I would say a push for putting social and the social transition at the heart of the climate transition is really need. And then my third point would be that we are often working on mitigation strategies, so to decarbonate the economy, but we have also to look at how climate change is already affecting us. Of course, Europe has a privilege there, but we can see that it's already affecting us also with heat waves, for example, and this is concrete for the world of work. If someone is working outside by 35 degrees, this is concrete. This has concrete effect on his health. So it's also a field that we have to investigate and that we have to work together at community level, at company level, to see how climate change already affect people and communities, and to gain new rights in these different angles. And I think this is the way that we will also gain the support of workers and communities to the climate policies. Not only discussing about decarbonation that is needed, but also discussing about how it concretely affects them. So I would say that from the dialogue we had today, I think we are really the expert that should lead the European Green Deal. So I hope, and the Green Deal at world level. So I think we have to continue this dialogue to ensure that we will have also this power and this pressure to be the experts that are heard, to ensure that our collective action leads to concrete change in policy making.
So, Ludovic, I'm seeing questions about the corporate sector. And indeed, we have friends and we have foes in the corporate sector. There are those businesses who know they need to change and are, you know, inviting people to dialogue tables, whether it's nationally or internationally. Where's the biggest lobby pressure on the European Union? Which sectors are really lobbying governments not to, or to restrict the change?
I'm not sure about who's lobbying the most, but I think that our main challenge is that in fact, employers' organizations and employers often want to slow down the pace because they don't know where they are going in terms of business model. And this, in fact, even for those who want to change to clean technologies, can mean that they invest also to downgrade working condition. So that they will put climate against social, as it was said before. So I think that even in those who are wanting to, we have, of course, enemies that don't want and that deny and that don't want to change their models. This we have, of course, to fight, but we have also to fight those who will change to green the economy, but using this to lower the working conditions, lower the wages in the sector. So I think it's also there that we have really to see how we influence corporate interest, and this is where the question of redistribution and the question of inequalities come also in the discussion. Because if we do not redistribute the wealth that is produced, and collective bargaining for us is one tool, but it's not the only one. Taxation is also a tool to redistribute the wealth. I think we have to tackle this with them and not let businesses set their own pathway to decarbonation without our involvement.
So there's no one out there with a hand up, but if someone wants to open their mic and make a contribution, please feel free. But in the meantime, I'm going to, if there's no questions, I'm going to ask all of you to do something. If you think this dialogue, both from a country perspective in terms of partnership with young people and trade unions, and from a regional and global perspective is valuable, put your thumbs up. Should we do more of these? Should I make Bert add a whole lot of other work to his agenda? Well, he's got a thumbs up. Look at that. Thumbs up everywhere. Okay, then we're going to promise you that we'll do some regional work on this. Mitzi, I'm coming back to you and others in that regard. Ludovic, clearly you've got the hot seat in Europe. We'll look at see with Louisa and Bram and others how we build a greater, you know, dialogue across Europe, and we'll support you to do that because you know you're really busy. And indeed globally, we need HETA to think about with you how we not just build our voices when we meet in UN meetings, but more broadly around a collective set of demands into the UN. So it's on. This is the beginning of an intergenerational dialogue. I must say, it really pleases me because I've been driving this notion in our union movement, and we've tried it in areas around peace and democracy and other areas, but now on climate and just transition. So I'm delighted. And we're going to finish early because I think everybody's got a night and a day ahead of them. But we're going to take you out with indeed a video from the Irish team, because they were so pleased that we started this conversation that they went the extra mile to make a video about partnership. So thank you all, and indeed next time we will seek your advice about, at both regional and national and global level, about how you think we should design such a conversation. I'm delighted to have had the privilege and the pleasure to be with you, and I thank you all for being part of it. Over to you, Bert, and thank you all.
Yes, thank you very much, all the speakers. I think it was just marvelous. And yeah, stay in contact. You have my details. You know how to find us. Contact us if you think we can help or contribute or should contribute. And I found this video that our colleagues from Ireland made quite nice to show at the end. So have a nice day, and yeah, enjoy the Christmas period or the party period that's coming on. Thank you.
And please let us give a big round of applause for this amazing moderation. I think it's really tough to facilitate such talk, but this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon.
Everybody, and thank you again.
Thank you.
See you Saturday, Louisa.
I'd also just like to invite everyone to sign Fridays for Future's pledge, fridaysforfuture.com/fight-for-1.5. Thank you.
It's a deal.
Very good. And there goes the video.
I'm striking today to make sure that I have a future, that I can tell my kids that we did something to save the future of the only planet we can survive on.
I'm here today because climate change is the most important thing at the minute in time. There's nothing more important than it. And today is the national strike, the international strike. So why wouldn't I come up today? It's the most important thing that we have to do.
As unions acting as allies with school climate strikers, we have opened the doors of our union buildings across the country as meeting spaces for their work. We've assisted them with our expertise in protest organising and movement building. We have acted as a liaison with our local police force on their behalf as protests grew. We created opportunities for them to speak directly to trade union members, both at local and national level, about the challenges of climate change, and have used our workers' power to amplify their voice through our union newspapers, social media and websites. In campaigning for just transition, our cooperation has led to a greater understanding amongst us all of what a just transition envisages, including the guarantee of decent jobs and how workers and their communities will be impacted by the move to a zero pollution future. Tackling the challenges of climate action can often be daunting, but our union movement has been re-energised by the passion, commitment and vision of school climate strikers in bringing about real climate action by governments. Our union movement has become more relevant to young activists as we mobilise for climate action together. As we learn from each other, this generation of future trade union members and organisers will know why trade unions are essential to our world of work. Our journey together has only begun. The future of our planet and our people are in our hands. This is a local issue and a global issue. In securing a carbon-free future, we must ensure that no one is left behind. Collective action and intergenerational solidarity will bring about this change. Together, we will bring about faster and fairer climate action. We must act now.